Showtime! Welcome to the show. I'm Brent Holland, and welcome one and all to Night Fright. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, get a juice going, get a beverage of your choice going. We're going to have a good time tonight. Folks, we're going to take you on a roller coaster ride tonight, up and down and all around, and it's going to be one heck of a blast. Via Skype from Abbotsford, BC, one of the most beautiful places in the world, is Colin McSween, our guest tonight. He's written a book called At the Dorm of Memory, and that's about a first-person JFK witness that was involved in all the goings-ons that were taking place on November 22nd. But on top of that, Colin has been in the funeral business for, I don't know, what is it, Colin, 25 years, something like that?
32 years.
He's got
32 years.
32 years. We're going to get into some behind-the-scenes stories, folks. It's going to be fantastic. Some creepy stories as well. We're going to be looking at... he was also... part of the British Columbia Coroner's Office, managing homicide scenes and assisting in them, major crime autopsies, right there in British Columbia. He's researched and experimented with firearms alleged to have been involved with the JFK assassination. And as an actor, you remember the show The X-Files was broadcast... I guess back in the 90s or so, folks. It was being shot in BC, and he played Bill Greer, which was JFK's limo driver, during one of the episodes on the assassination. I don't know if you remember, but the cigarette-smoking man was down in the gutter in a storm drain, shooting up at allegedly shooting up at the president. So we're going to get to all that tonight. Strap in and hang on. Here we go.
There is a time to question. There is a time for answers. There is a time to challenge. There is a time to speculate. There is a time for change. There is a time for truth. The time is now. Welcome to Night Fright, your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio. And now your host, Brent Holland.
Welcome, folks. Welcome. Colin McSween's our guest tonight via Skype all the way from Abbotsford, British Columbia. Colin, welcome to the show for the second time. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Brent. It's great.
Let's start off right away, shall we? Can you tell us some behind-the-scenes stories from your years and experience in the funeral business? Tell us some creepy stories.
Well, I'll just start by saying that I'm very fortunate. I made some good connections. I've met some nice people that were very wonderful, and they gave me an opportunity to get started in this field, which was something that I never would have picked for myself, but an opportunity opened up, and the people that hired me were wonderful. They were just great, and they were very supportive. I think some of my earliest experiences were just dealing with things that were so far from my imagination, it was impossible to believe that I was doing the things that I was doing. I think one of the first frights that I gave anybody was I was living with my mother at the time when I started my apprenticeship, and I remember saying to her, I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to be bringing home my take-home assignments, and I'm going to be using your dining room table. Well, she assumed I meant bodies, and she kind of had a bit of a bird, and no, that's not what I meant. It was the written assignments for my correspondence modules, and so once she understood that, we were pretty good to go. But she found it as interesting as anybody did, I guess. She was quite amazed that this was something that I was wanting to do or was going to give a try. And I just sort of took it a day at a time, and before I knew it, a couple of months had rolled by, and I decided to get fully involved as an apprentice. And the years have just kind of shot by in a big hurry. One of the first experiences I had that I felt was a little bit eerie, and there's a totally perfectly logical explanation, but I was dressing a very large man, and he was on a skinny cart that we'd actually inherited somehow from one of the old hospitals in Vancouver. And in order to keep his arms positioned while he was lying on this table, I had two rubberized head positioning blocks, sort of like large pillows, if you will. And I had these underneath his elbows. Well, one of them was just barely on the edge of the table, and I guess the block was slowly sliding, which I couldn't hear and I didn't see because I had my back to the dear gentleman. And I had his clothing all laid out on the other table, and I had my back to him. And I took a look at the shirt, and I knew from the shirt size that there was no way that this was going to fit him properly. And we don't necessarily always open the seams and things like that on clothing, but in this case I felt it was necessary, but there was no convenient seam to open, so I cut the shirt at the bottom, and I pulled on the shirt and split it up to the collar. And as the shirt split, at that same instant, the head block that was holding his right arm gave way, and his arm came down and swung across about a foot, and he smacked me across the butt. And I just about put a new skylight in the room. I just about took off like a Saturn V rocket. I was totally speechless. And again, there's a perfectly logical explanation for it, but the timing could not have been better or worse, depending on how you want to look at it. As far as encounters with anything supernatural, I'm not given to believe in those things, but I don't discount them. I do believe in the spirit world, and I do have a philosophy about life, and I am a Christian. I do attend church and so on, but I try and keep everything in perspective. And I think everybody in let's call it the death care or the final care industry or profession, we all find different ways of dealing with our stress, and some do it by alcohol or other means of relief. For me, I find comedy, which has always been a natural part of my character, has provided to be a tremendous tool that way. But one of the experiences that I had happened not really early in my experience. It actually happened fairly late. This would be about 9 years ago, and I was working in a mortuary that is no longer in existence, but it was in East Vancouver, and I was alone one Sunday, and it was a nice day that was clear out and seemed to be fairly warm and sunny, and I was working in the front office, and I thought I could hear someone whispering. And I thought, well, that's not unusual because there's other staff members that sometimes stop by. They want to pick something up, or they're using the computer or whatever. But I thought I'd better just see who it is because, hey, I felt like sitting and having a chat. I'm a bit of a social butterfly. So I got up and I walked to the door, and I looked from the door in this room where I was through the foyer toward the entrance into the chapel. And there was what appeared to me to be a little girl, and I'm going to say that she was somewhere between 7 and 10 years of age, perhaps. She was wearing a light misty green dress, and I don't know fabrics that well, but it looked like sort of a crinoline kind of a thing where the dress was kind of splayed out like a party dress. She had bob socks on and looked like patent leather shoes of some kind. And she sort of glanced at me and smiled and appeared to giggle. And I thought, well, somebody's got their little girl with them. They must be on their way to a party. So I start walking in that direction, and as I get to where she was, she had trotted off and gone into the chapel and then turned left and disappeared from my sight. So I got to the chapel entrance, and I could hear her sort of chirping and singing to herself and counting. And so I walked to the aisle, and I looked up the aisle, and up at the head of the aisle, in the location where we might normally place a casket or a table or something, here she was on the floor playing jacks. I don't know if people remember jacks, but the rubber ball and the little star. So she was playing jacks. So I walked up towards her, and I got maybe 10 feet away, and she disappeared, just vanished.
Aha.
And I've never seen her since. I didn't go out of my way to try and connect, like in that classic movie that Christopher Reeve did, with Jane Seymour, where he kills himself trying to reconnect with her. But I did watch every once in a while if I was there on weekends, which I was the weekend guy for about 5 years. I would listen and watch just in case there was a recurrence of this. Now, I don't know who it was. And I couldn't tell you from what era she was. Her hair was done similar to what you would expect to see. Who was the child star in the 1930s?
Shirley Temple.
Shirley Temple. She's sort of done up the way you'd expect to see Shirley Temple. So whether that is indicative that this girl maybe had died in the 1930s or in the 1940s, I don't know. All I know is that building had been there since about World War I. So it could be anybody. And I wouldn't have even known where to start. Although I had access to all their records, I wouldn't have known where to start looking up information. And there was nothing on computer.
Of course. Was it always a funeral home?
That's something I'm not absolutely certain of. I think at one time it may have been a private residence, and then it got converted into that. But I really don't know the history of the building, and the people that I worked for hadn't owned it from its inception. The people that I worked for, their grandparents had acquired it from somebody else. So I really never found that out. I mean, there might be somebody out there that could tell me more about it. My other encounter with the supernatural happened outside a funeral service, but I was on my way to work. And it was on a weekend, and I was staying at my mother's place, and I left her apartment and got in my car, and I turned right into the first street beside her building, and it was the street that I used to deliver newspapers on back in the 60s. And as I drove up the road, I saw a sign for a yard sale, and I thought, well, I'm 45 minutes early, and it only takes 12 minutes to get to work from here. So I pulled over on the side of the road, and as I did, this elderly lady came out to the curb, almost like she was expecting me, and I could tell from where I was that her hair was kind of standing on end. And I got out of the car, and I said, is everything all right? And she said, who are you? And I told her my name, didn't mean anything to her. She says, are you connected to this house? And I looked up at it, and I said, well, yeah. I said, I used to play here a lot. I knew the kids that lived here. I said their dad worked for the city, and I told them a bit of information. Well, to cut to the chase, they were, and as far as I know, may still be having a recurring visitation from a girl that died there in the 1960s.
Wow.
And now, I believe that there's benevolent spirits.
Yes.
There are also malevolent spirits, or what we might call mimics. And I could go into more detail on that, and I'm not sure if you want to spend any more time on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, all I know is that I had gone to school with the siblings of this person. I remember when she took sick. I remember that they used to keep her on the sofa in the front room. Their mother did up the sofa like a bed, and that's where she was kept and looked after and nursed. I'm not going to go into details because these people are out there, and if they're watching or listening, I don't want them to think I'm betraying any confidences, but it was a disease that if it had happened 20 years later, there was every reason to expect a recovery, but in the 60s, it was a death knell, And I've gone back about 3 times to talk to these people, and each time it's been getting a little bit more intense. There's a lady that lives there. She's in her 60s. There's a daughter in her 30s, and the daughter has, I think it's 2 children, and one of the children plays with this little apparition. They actually play together. And she said, can you describe what the girl looked like? I described her perfectly. She said, well, where was she in the house? I said, she was on a sofa. Well, where was the sofa? And without going into the house, standing at the curb about 60 feet from the house, I told her, pointed at the windows and told her exactly where everything was located. Well, the more we talked, the more harried it got. And I asked her, I said, I know a really good fellow that was one of my pastors out in the Fraser Valley that now lives about 3 blocks from you. And I said, if you'd like, I can contact him and give him your name and number, or I can give you his name and number. And if you feel you'd like somebody to talk to, he might be able to help you. Well, no, she wasn't interested in that. She was more interested in trying to deal with the situation herself. So I've had no further contact. I shouldn't say none. I did have one further contact when one of the little girl's parents passed away. And I happened to see it one afternoon, and I was sitting in the same funeral home where I saw this other little girl, and I read this obituary, and so I looked up the family and called them. And the spouse of the person that died said they'd love to have me come out for coffee, and I did. And what was interesting was the day of the funeral, they invited me back to the house after the reception. They took me back out to their house, and the eldest daughter took me through the living room to look at some family photos, and she showed me a family photo that was taken about 3 years before this little girl died. And she said, I don't understand it, but that's, she named the girl that died, and that picture's constantly out of focus. Not everybody in the photo, just her.
Whoa. So there's something. There's something. What it is, I don't know, but...
I said nothing The thing is, I don't know if it's because I've had a lot of personal experience with death. I've lost a lot of people that have been very close to me, including a sister on April 22nd, 1965. Same date, April 22nd, as Aubrey's death. I don't know what it is, but I just feel if, I believe there's a God. I believe that for some reason or other, God sees fit to show people certain things, and there's a lesson in it somewhere. And, sometimes there's things we can learn and apply from it. Sometimes you just go, well, it's an experience. It's there to keep me wondering and to realize that I'm, there's something much greater beyond who and what I am.
Wow.
So,
Colin McSween, folks, www.nightfrightshow.com. Click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. And we're going to be getting to that book in just a second. He's written, it's the life story of Aubrey Rike. And Aubrey Rike was part and parcel to some of the events that took place November 22nd, 1963. That, of course, was the assassination of President Kennedy. And we're going to get to Aubrey's role in all that, first-person witness, shortly. Right now, we're recounting some of the tales, if you will, of Colin's experiences as a funeral director, and pretty unnerving stuff. Colin, like you, I've had to deal with death from an early age. People all around me dying, and if there's anything I hate is the smell of flowers. It always reminds me of death. Where does that tradition come from? Is that because of the old days before embalming? It was to mask the scent of the body decaying?
There's a lot of variations on it. Flowers are also full of they're full of symbolism. Like the red rose indicates, the bleeding heart. It indicates the cherish and the love and affection. And there's other ones like baby's breath, that speak of the promise of better things in the future. Like all flowers carry some sort of message. Now you have other people that are allergic to flowers, and I had an experience like that where the person had a casket spray made out of vegetables.
Wow.
And it looked absolutely fantastic. I mean, the florist knocked herself out and came out. It looked like flowers. And it was all peppers and radishes and, I mean, you name it, right? She made the radishes look like roses. The peppers looked like snapdragons, which reminds me, snapdragon, you know what that speaks of? It speaks of old age. The old age person that says, I'm in the snapdragon part of my life. Whatever hasn't snapped is dragon. So... It's like the guy that says, when I was a kid, it was my cereal that went snap, crackle, pop. Now at my age, it's my body every time I move. So, but there's a lot of symbolism. The idea of to help mask odors, that's a very strong, pardon the pun, distinct possibility. I really don't know. I hadn't given that any thought. I do know that my grandmother, McSween, my dad's mother, when she died in August 64, that was one thing that really nauseated me, like yourself, the smell of flowers. It wasn't the first funeral I'd been at, but it was the first time where I had noticed it. And there are some flowers that are far more aromatic and than others. And so it may have just been the combination. It seems to me that we had a lot of hydrangeas, and hydrangeas, when they're in full bloom, can have quite a powerful fragrance, especially when they're indoors. It also depends on the quality of ventilation. And I know that the building where my grandmother's visitation was held was an older building. In fact, it's been gone now already about 33 years. But there's many things behind flowers, but you don't have to have flowers. There's other things that speak richer tokens about a person's life necessarily than flowers. But I will say this, that some people say no flowers, but it's amazing how many times I have walked people at a visitation to let's call it a slumber room to see the departed or whatever. And as they approach the room, there's a small arrangement of flowers that somebody has sent, even though they didn't want flowers. And it's amazing how many of them go, oh, how nice. And they really mean it, because like suddenly they sense the intangible value. Flowers somehow seem to speak a token of respect that words simply fail us. You know what I'm saying? And it's not like, some people say, spend money on me while I'm alive. Don't be spending it on me after I'm gone. Well, that's nice too. But all of these things are done for the benefit of the living. We send it to people to indicate our respect, and we grab a card, and maybe it's a blank card, and it almost stays that way other than our signature, because we really don't know what to say to people when that happens. I mean, we can say, I'm sorry for your loss, or, but what else can you say? May it ease the comfort to know that others are aware and we care, right?
I suspect, it's something that we're all going to have to face one day. Not for a long time, God forbid.
Well, we hope. Yeah.
What is the most disturbing aspect? I'm trying to put myself in your shoes, and would seem to me you had mentioned kids before.
Yeah.
I would think the death of a child.
That's difficult. I think it depends on, again, your philosophy of life and things like that. But even if you have a very strong philosophy of life, as I do, still, when you see people that die, that you look at them and you think this person realistically could have had 50, 60, 70, 80 years. That's kind of disturbing, and especially when they've died at the hands of someone else or because of somebody else's incompetence or stupidity. And I'm not going to cite incidences or names or dates or locations, but I think the cases of victims of abuse of their various kinds, not just physical, but other types of abuse, has disturbed me greatly. I know when I was apprenticing, and the company I was working for happened to be sharing space with the Vancouver Coroner's Office, which is how I got into that aspect of work. We handled a couple of Clifford Olson's victims. And that is one of the reasons why I'm an arch proponent for capital punishment. I mean, you can argue all you want against it, or whoever wants, but you know what? I can provide you some first ring reasons, So, and I have met over the years in various occupations that I've had, whether it's been in film or whatever, I have met people that have been related or connected or been friends of families that lost victims, not just to him, but maybe to others. And, I had one situation that was particularly disturbing, where it was a mother and child that were killed together in the same collision. And the child had actually been just a couple months short of birth. And that was very hard for me. And I was called by this mortuary. I do a lot of private contractual, what we call trade services. I'm an embalmer. I do a lot of restorative art. And that's one of my specializations. And so I get called in to handle a lot of cases that the average mortuary would rather not take care of. They want to bring a specialist in to do that work for them. And so that's more the kind of thing that I've been doing, especially for about the past 12 years. And that was one that I knew from the moment I worked on the mother and child that night, which was something like 7 or 8 hours or 10 hours. I knew that there was just something from that moment on. I knew I changed. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it changed me. It changed how I felt. It changed how I viewed things. I think it put a higher price on the value of life.
How do you display a person that is pregnant that has died with the baby inside? Do you remove the baby and display them together somehow, or how does that work?
Let's see. There's an internet connection problem. There we are.
There we go.
Okay, sorry. You want to rephrase the question?
Sure.
And I missed part of your question.
Sure, no problem. When you have a woman that is pregnant and she's well along, and like you said, a few days before birth, and she dies, she passes away. When you put the body out for display, I don't know how else to say it.
Yeah.
Do you remove the child, or do you keep the child inside the body, or?
No, we don't get involved in that at all. If the person has died a non-clinical death, they've been killed in an accident or something where it's not been a clinically monitored situation in a hospital, 99 times out of 100 they're going to do an autopsy. And in most instances, an autopsy does involve evisceration to some extent. And evisceration would normally involve the removal of the child. Now, in some instances, it may be that the child is still alive, although the mother has died. And so if the paramedics are there quick enough and the child is alive, they can deliver the child by C-section and keep the child alive on life support, depending on its survivability outside of the uterus. So sometimes you get cases where the mother has died and the child has lived. But you get others where, because of the amount of damage to the mother and the trauma to the baby succumbs. And so, when it comes to a viewing, if the family has decided they want to have a visitation with an open casket, then that's going to be particular individual choice, like what would you like us to do, and that's going to be up to the person that has the legal right to make that decision.
I see. Now, you had alluded to the fact that you worked on a couple of Olsen's.
Yeah, and I can't go into details on those. I just, yeah.
Can you talk about any other cases without giving away something that somebody may recognize, just maybe in generalities, just talk about bodies and perhaps what has been done to them, something along those lines?
Well, the only thing I can say is that this is just my own personal edict or decree. Every time I approach a dead human body, regardless of the circumstances, I keep in mind the following, that at some point in their experience, they were somebody's child.
Yes.
And hopefully they brought some happiness into somebody's world. And I don't know how they died. I don't know the secrets of their life. And even if I find out something about them, as far as I'm concerned, their secrets are going to die with them. And then what happens when I treat somebody, from the moment I pick them up and I transfer them and I take them into my care, I operate as though I've got closed circuit cameras watching what I'm doing. And I imagine that, okay, the next of kin are watching, and they're going to approve of everything I'm doing because they're going to know that what I'm doing is intended for their very best. And that's been my approach to my work all along. As far as cases, I think one of the nastiest cases I ever encountered was when I was doing contractual work for the coroner service. And we had a fellow that had been obviously hiking, and it was on one of the coast Gulf Islands or somewhere, and it was years ago, and he had fallen off a cliff. This is the best they could ascertain. And as he fell, a tree limb hit him in the shoulder, in the hollow of the shoulder, between the clavicle and the scapula, and he was falling with such force that the tree branch traversed his torso and came out his left thigh, and then the weight took the tree branch off, and he was impaled. I've read of similar situations where people have been going at high speed, and there's an iron gate with a tubular piece of steel, and they don't see it, and they hit that, and the tubular steel comes through and impales them. I've read of situations, there was a police officer had something similar where a guardrail came through the front fender of his police car and went through his left side. Some of these people miraculously survive. I mean, how they survive, I mean, it's, the luck, right? The draw, right? I mean, it's amazing. And then you get others that, depending on what the instrument of death happens to hit, I don't recall any of the other details on that particular case, but that's one that has stayed with me for a long time. I'm sure will till the time I'm no longer on this earth, and after that I might think about it from time to time. And I don't mean to laugh, because it has a funny effect on a person. You don't laugh, haha, isn't that funny? But it's almost kind of, I guess it's a relief valve for me. It shows you that it still affects me a little bit. I work with a lot of people in this field. I taught the BC school for 13 years. I don't believe any funeral director that says, oh, I don't let it bother me. Nonsense. Everything in your life, everything that happens to you affects you.
Completely.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah. Folks, our guest tonight, Colin McSween, we're just talking about some of the cases he's worked on in the funeral business, as well as contractor for the coroner's office in BC, British Columbia. He's written a great book, which we're going to get to in just a few seconds here, called At the Door of Memory. It's the true story of a fellow by the name of Aubrey Rike. Aubrey Rike was right there in the midst of all the goings on, November 22nd, 1963. That's the assassination of President Kennedy. We're going to talk about that in just a few seconds, and Aubrey's role and how the book came about. I want to talk a little bit now, if you don't mind, the X-Files and your acting career. We're going to change the subject, yeah. Rick, because that's a heavy subject, man. I don't know how you deal with it, especially when it comes to the kids. And I'll give you a good example, Colin. There's a display that's going on around North America. I saw it in Montreal, called The Bodies, where they've taken real human bodies.
Yeah, they do plastination.
That's right. Yeah, it disturbed the hell out of me. I couldn't sleep for 3 or 4 nights. Because for me, these were no longer... I guess I'm an empath to a certain degree. I I saw them as real human beings, even though
They are, yeah.
even though I know the spirit has gone on, if you wish. And, you know, I went to see it with my honey. It didn't bother her at all, because this is her philosophy that, no, these are just empty shells. And I knew that, too, on a intellectual level. But I couldn't just get over the fact
But those human shells housed the soul for years, you know, and people say that, families say that to me as a funeral, well, it's just a husk. Well, you know, the ones that come in to see the husk, it's amazing how much all of a sudden this husk has great value to them. You know, I think that's a way of people have. It's a sort of a coping mechanism. They say, well, it's just a husk. It helps them sort of dismiss the temporal. Sorry, I cut in on you there.
No, that you're very right. You're very right, and that's helped me out too. So obviously, part of your great character is being able to give condolences and help people get through such a horrible time. It's one of the, you know, we celebrate when a person comes into the world. And of course we don't when the person leaves it, even though we all believe to a certain extent that they're going on to something much better. And it's hard to get through those moments. It is absolutely probably the worst period of a person's life, even more so than their own death, I suspect. Yeah, it's the finality of it, I suspect, is the problem. I mean, they're gone. That's it. Okay, something happier. Let's talk about your acting career. The X-Files,
Yeah.
if that's happier.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, I was contacted back in 90 or 91 by a Broadway production company that were actually performing in Vancouver at the Queen Elizabeth Theatre. And I was living in Vernon at the time and managing a couple of funeral homes. And they were looking for some technical advice on trying to do something with cosmetics for stage. And they had contacted various people. They got put onto the BC Funeral Association. The Funeral Association said, well, you know, the best person we have in BC you can talk to would be Colin McSween. So they came up to Vernon and spent a couple days shadowing me, and I sat down and talked to them at some length about cosmetics and different things they could try. And that was the first time I did any consulting. That was for stage. And I had done a little bit of personal theater stuff back in my high school and my elementary school days. And then about 2 years later, what's now Global Television did a 30th anniversary news special on the Kennedy assassination, and I was their featured guest for about a 7-minute primetime news spot at 6 p.m. and again at 11 p.m. And the fellow that did the audio work on that, 3 years later, 3 years later, was doing the audio work for a Hallmark Hall of Fame movie called Ellen Foster, which featured Jenna Malone, who some of you might be familiar with. Jenna Malone, she's now about 27. She's quite a bright young lady. And I got called to consult on this movie, Ellen Foster, and they wanted me to oversee a graveside scene. And they'd set up a fake cemetery in a park in Tsawwassen. So here I got hired for this spot. I worked with Julie Harris and Ted Levine and a whole bunch of big names. Had a wonderful time. I got to help direct Julie Harris in a deathbed scene where she dies in about a week later in a different scene. And then I supervised the removal scene. So it's been kind of neat. The first day I was with them, we were doing the cemetery scene. We got rained out for about an hour. And I happened to have a large collapsible cover that was about 12 feet by 12 feet. And I told the director, I said, you want me to bring this tent? It'll provide some shelter for some of your people. He said, sure. Well, as I was setting it up, the audio technician who'd been with Global before recognized me, came over, started questioning me on the assassination. And I said, you know, this is something that I like to get into because it sometimes generates a lot of attention that's unwarranted, and I don't want to do that. He said, no, that's fine. He says, you know, and he brought the director over, and the director wanted to talk to me about it. So we wound up huddled under this big umbrella, including Julie Harris and some other stars, and discussing the Kennedy assassination for about an hour. Then at lunch, the conversation carried on. Of course, the more I talked, the less I ate, which was fine because my doctor likes that. He says, I want to see more of you or less of you more often. So anyhow, this led to an invitation to come and meet with some of the people from the X-Files. And that year, the previous year, they had published a book called The Book of the Unexplained. And in that book, I have a copy here. There's a full page on the Kennedy assassination.
Somewhere.
And it's got a photo, the Algins photo that shows Clint Hill on the back step of the limo. And it says, this is a story that we have no intentions of ever dealing with. Now, apparently, because of my information on the assassination, it changed Chris Carter's mind, and he decided to do an episode on the assassination.
Wow.
Now, that was neat, but on the downside is that directors and writers don't usually take the technical person's advice seriously. They already have in mind what they want to shoot. They make their decision regardless of what you tell them. But I wound up supplying my rifles and some other stuff, some photographs, some police memorabilia, limousine fender flags, and other things that I have, which they used. At least if they didn't use them directly, they used them as templates to make ones for what they were going to do on the Kennedy assassination. Now, the episode was actually on the Kennedy assassination and Martin Luther King's assassination in April '68. And I consulted a little bit on both, but mostly on the JFK one. Well, then about 3 weeks later, I was helping out with stunt cars, and they looked into renting the car that I consulted Kevin McDonald, which he built, which Oliver Stone used in his movie JFK, but they found out the guy that owned it was in Florida. He wanted a small fortune for the use of the car. So the fellow from X-Files phoned me. He says, where can I get a 61 or a Lincoln that we can build a Kennedy car out of? And I said, well, Kennedy's car was a 61, but it had a 1962 grille on it at the time of the assassination. And I said, there is a 62 Lincoln. It's a sedan. You'd have to cut the roof off. He says, where is it? I said, it's in a farm on Guide Meridian Road near Lyndon, Washington. Well, the next day they had it in a garage in North Vancouver, and the top was off, and they wanted me to come in there and show them what to do to build the Kennedy car. And it was amazing what they did with about $5,000. It was absolutely amazing. It looked pretty good on film. They offered it to me after the shoot, and I wasn't interested. It was a piece of junk. Every time they wanted me to accelerate, the thing would die. So I said, no, I've been there, done that. I had a 61 that I restored 34 years ago, and it was identical to the one Kennedy rode in on Election Day in 1960. And they're a lot of work and a lot of headache. Unless you got the room and space and money, it's too much. So anyhow, they called me up about a week later, and they said, we'd like you to come in for wardrobe fit. And I said, well, I think you got the wrong guy. I'm not an actor. I said, I'm a consultant. I'm a friend of Jim Pates and so on. And they said, no, we want you to come in. So I said, well, I got to come in from Abbotsford. I have a funeral on such and such a day. It's a graveside service out in Burnaby. And they said, well, when you're done that, come over to North Van. So I did. And I walk in there, and they hand me a suit. And on the back of the suit, it says Greer. Well, that was the chauffeur of the Kennedy limousine. Well, I got to tell you, my name is Colin William Robert. Well, his name was William Robert Greer. And he was the spitting image of my old man. Jeez. And I had recurring nightmares when I was 10 years old that I had been sitting in the front seat of the limo, watching what was going on during the shooting and being powerless to do anything about it. Mm. And the eeriest moment of the day that we shot the assassination was when I slid in behind the wheel, and I adjusted the rearview mirror, and I saw the Kennedy sitting there. And I literally froze, and then I started to cry, and they said, are you going to be all right? It was it was hard.
No
I got through that, yeah, because the girl that played Jackie, the way they did her up, she was very convincing. And the guy that played JFK, his name was actually Mark Lincoln. Well, we were in a Lincoln, and Kennedy's limo, the interior, the passenger compartment was styled after a Mark II. So it's just just weird stuff. Don Wilson was a great guy. He played Connolly, and I forgot the name of the guy that played Kellerman, but we had some fun. I think one of the funniest aspects, and I hate to make light of something like that, but was the scene where they got Jackie climbing out onto the trunk of the car. Of course, she's got her butt up in full sight, and I'm looking at it in the mirror, and the girl's name was Heike. And I said, hey, Heike. She says, what? I said, I just figured out why this is called a rear view mirror. And somebody else in the car yelled out, bummer. So, and anyway, I shouldn't go into any more fun, because you've got to sort of be there to experience the moments. But it was an interesting day. It was about a 13 to 14 hour day. For what turned out to be about 40 seconds of footage.
Yeah, people don't realize that what goes into making a film or even a television show, So
we had real Vancouver cops dressed up in Dallas uniforms, with real sidearms, and we had cops ringing the streets with loaded sidearms because we were on a public street shooting what was obviously the Kennedy assassination. And they thought, for all we know, there's a couple of flakes out there that want to try and,
Absolutely.
So that was my first shot. And I got from that. I wound up in Millennium, and then things have gone from one to another. So
you were in Millennium?
Yeah.
Which part did you play in Millennium?
Well, I can't remember. It was one episode, and I played a funeral director. So I said, "Hey, I'm really out of character here, guys. I'm not used to this." I'm kidding, of course.
I'm gonna look for it because I have the series. I love that show.
And I was clean shaven, so the same as I was in the X-Files. So I keep a photograph of myself, and I have a number of photos that they gave me from location from the X-Files. I got a whole photo album full of pictures from the X-Files.
What was it like working with Chris Carter?
I really only spoke to him on the phone. The people I dealt with, there was a man named Nigel Habgood, and there was another guy named Jim Pate, and there were two other people, and I've forgotten their name. And all I know is that about 3 months or 4 months after that, I wound up on a contract to manage a funeral home, and I had no time to work in film. And I did this management thing for 3 years. When the contract ran out, my wife said, "See if you can get a hold of the people in the film industry, see if you can get any work." By that point, the X-Files had already moved down to California. So my wife didn't want to move. But then I wound up contacting the fellow that had played Kennedy, and he put me onto some people, and one thing led to another. And so these days, for about the past 9 years or so, I've been with Boss Management Talent, and I've worked with a lot of big names. It's been an amazing experience. I mean, one of the bigger names, I guess, is John Voight. So I've worked with him. I've worked with Martin Sheen. In fact, Martin Sheen and I had quite a visit on the set of one movie we were working on together, and we talked about Kennedy.
Tell us about that.
Well, he played Kennedy.
That's right.
In the Kennedy miniseries that came out on the 20th anniversary in 1983.
He also played Bobby Kennedy.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
Yes, he did.
Yeah.
And I also told him that I had built I built a death bust, full-size, life-size death bust of JFK as he looked at the autopsy for the movie The Commission, which Martin Sheen is in. And it's a Mark Sobel film that's being produced in Hollywood.
Guess who's writing the music for that?
Who? You are. Yeah. Wow. Awesome. There you go.
There you go. Small world, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. So no, then I mean, I won't go any further because it's name dropping, and it doesn't really change who I am, and it doesn't really take us anywhere. But I thought Martin Sheen, that was interesting. I'm a big fan of his. I've admired his work for years. From the time I saw him play Private Slovak, that was a sad movie.
Yeah, it sure was. What were his opinions on the well, I guess I can already know, but folks, I'm just going to ask Colin what his opinions were about the assassination. He did the voiceover for Oliver Stone.
Oh, Oliver Stone. Oh, yeah. I mean, we really didn't get a lot of time to talk. It was just basically, more or less, chatting. That's really interesting. And what did you think of this? We didn't really sit down and have lunch or anything. Mind you, a cousin of Jackie Kennedy's that's a dear friend of mine that lives in BC has had lunch with Martin Sheen, and he has no idea who this girl is. And she just kind of picks his brain, and then anytime she hears if she's talking to him, she'll call me and share some of it, because I usually get out with her about once a year for lunch.
Fascinating. Folks, Colin McSween, we're going to get to his book that he's written called At the Door of Memory. It's the true life story of Aubrey Rike. Easy way to get the book, www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on tonight's guest book cover. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. Okay, Colin, let's go. Aubrey Rike. There's a sweetheart of a guy that's just passed away.
Yeah. 2 years ago, April 22nd.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was his role that day, November 22nd, 1963?
Well, he was an ambulance driver. He had been for about 3 years at that point, or going into his fourth year. And he'd been working for Vernon O'Neill, and Vernon O'Neill had an establishment called O'Neill Funeral Home, or it was O'Neill Incorporated, but he ran a funeral home and an ambulance service. And at that time, he had two 1962 Ford Galaxy station wagons, which were done up as ambulances, and one was 606 and one was 605. 605 would wind up carrying Lee Harvey Oswald to the hospital on the Sunday after he was shot. 606 was the car that Aubrey was assigned to, and they used to do 24-hour shifts. So Aubrey's job on the 22nd of November started at about, I think it was just after 7 or towards 8, but he was there early and the shift started at 8 o'clock. And he and his partner, Dennis McGuire, who Aubrey nicknamed Peanuts, they worked very well together as a team, and they would make sure the car was ready for the day, and they'd go across the street to the Waffle House and get something to eat, and oftentimes wind up having to take it with them. And November 22nd, Aubrey had noted that the street seemed to be a bit difficult to get around on, and his partner said, well, the president's in town today. And he said, what president? Because there'd been a lot of VIPs and dignitaries in town all the previous week, including Richard Nixon and a number of other people. So Peanut said, well, President Kennedy. And not that Aubrey is not interested in things political. He was more inclined to be more of a Republican in his politics, but he really liked John F. Kennedy, really loved him, and loved watching him on TV and listening to him speak. And so that particular morning, he thought, well, gee, if we get a chance to see the president, that would be all right. You know, that would really be a bonus. So it was a quiet day in terms of ambulance duties. I think they had like 2 calls, and one was on what appeared to be a homeless man downtown. And he was reluctant to accept any help, and he thought, well, we're not going to force the man to accept help if he doesn't want it. So they let that one go. Then they got an ambulance call on a heart attack patient, and they took the heart attack patient to Baylor Hospital. And when they cleared from Baylor, it was 5 minutes past 12 noon, and the president had arrived at about 11:38. And his motorcade was already in process. It had been running about 15 minutes. And when they got back in the ambulance and cleared, the dispatcher put them on standby, and they turned the police radio up to see what was going on with the motorcade. And based on the motorcade's location at 12:05, which was the Continental Overpass at Lomo Alto on Lemon, Aubrey said, we're not going to get back to the funeral home in time to get close enough to see the president there. So he said, we'll find another intersection. So he went across town to Pearl Street, went northwest on Pearl, and came out to the intersection of Cedar Springs and Harwood, and he parked behind the crowd, and he gets out of the ambulance, the two of them, and they climbed up on the roof of the ambulance. And just as they got on the roof, Kennedy's car was rounding the corner in front of them about 20 to 25 feet away. And their action of getting up onto the car and being higher than the audience caught the president's attention, and he actually turned slightly in his seat and waved right at them. And there's a film that most people are unaware of. It's on YouTube, and it's called Dave Powers Film. Mm-hmm. And okay, that film's about 22 seconds long. It's filmed from the Secret Service car. The film runs up
right behind the president's limousine,
right behind Kennedy.
Yeah.
And halfway through the film, the car turns left, and it's turning left from Cedar Springs onto Harwood, and that's right where Rob and Dennis are.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, that's the only footage that shows this happening. But you don't see Aubrey and Dennis. You just see the president sort of go like that. But they're on a bit of a downhill grade, which is what the road does there. And you can't retrace that part of the motorcade because that road's been changed to one-way east, so it deliberately throws you off. So you used to come downhill, and then as you turned onto Harwood, you go uphill again slightly until you reach McKinney, which is your first cross street. And then there's a streetcar track there as well. So anyway, as he comes down, he turns left, and that was probably the second of what was supposed to be 3 or 4 left turns in the whole motorcade. So anyway, I told Glenda, Aubrey's wife, about it, and I keep trying to figure out some way of getting her a copy, and I'm too technologically to know how to do that. But I've tried to show her on her computer, and her computer is so old it won't play it. But if there's some way you have of getting that, I could give you her a way of getting that to her. She'd be thrilled. So anyway, we can talk about that some other time. But anyway, Aubrey, at that point, they jumped down off the car, and he got, my heart's racing. He thought, my God, I just saw the president. He looked at us, he waved at us. And as they're saying this to each other, they're like school kids. They get in the ambulance, and they're being called by the dispatcher on an epileptic seizure. So the epileptic seizure is happening on the 100 block North Houston Street, almost directly in front of the depository building. And Oliver Stone's movie shows a reenactment of this.
Yeah.
But you miss the significance of it because they don't explain what you're seeing.
Yeah.
And of course, the only problem Aubrey has with the scene, he says, first of all, the ambulance, they show it coming from Elm Street. He says, we didn't go Elm, we went down Main. The other problem is Mr. O'Neill never paid for white wall tires. So Aubrey was a bit of a stickler on details, but he said the ambulance in that scene has white walls. He says, we never had white walls. He says, Mr. O'Neill wouldn't pay for them. So anyhow, he said, we get there, the man's got a raspberry on his forehead. They're directly across the street from what's called the Sallyport entrance to the county jail, which interestingly is Sheriff Decker's office. And that morning, Sheriff Decker has told his men, you can dress in your finest and shine your shoes and stand on the sidewalk to watch the motorcade, but don't anybody lift a hand to help in security.
Weird.
And one of the men that worked in that department is still alive, and he has told me that and borne that out. He said, yes, we were told not to lift a hand. And right across the street from Sheriff Decker's office, this epileptic seizure happens. So Aubrey gets there, the man's got a skin raspberry thing, and he looks like maybe he's fallen, but there's no evidence of epilepsy. But it's on the motorcade route. He does have what it would rate as a head injury. They can't leave him there. They put him in the ambulance and they take him to Parkland because it's the county hospital and it specializes in various trauma, especially head trauma. So they get to Parkland, and as they're taking the man out of the back of the ambulance, this is probably now at 12:30, when the president's shooting happened, because he said, if we were in the car, we would have heard about the shooting on the police radio. If we were in the hospital, we would have heard about it and the stat call, and we would have been there to see the lockdown procedure. But he's getting the man out of the ambulance when this happened. So they took the man inside, and I don't know where you want me to go with the story from there, but I might be going into more detail.
No, that's fine. We've only got about 5 minutes left, though, and I do want to get to the point with the ring, because to me that's a very heartfelt moment.
Very good. Yeah. So the long and the short of it, after being approached by Secret Service demanding the gurney, and he doesn't know who they are because they don't produce any credentials, after they bring Kennedy and Connolly in, and he watches this going on, they're told to take their patient to stall number 8 by radiology. So they place their man on stall 8. They go back out to the ambulance because the Secret Service have now commandeered them and said, you're with us, you will transfer the president. As soon as they get him stabilized, we'll move him to a Catholic hospital. So they put new linen on the cot, take it out to the ambulance, and here's the president's car facing them with the back doors open, and they can see all the muck and gore. And the thing that kind of puzzled him was he said there were men in suits with buckets and towels, and they were already cleaning the car.
Yeah. Destroying evidence.
That bothered him. And but he says they were allowed to stay out there to watch this whole procedure and watch the roof go back on the car. And of course, we have a couple of photos of this going on in the book, including one that shows the bucket and the rags and so on. And they had a cigarette. At that point, they were taken back in, and for much of the next 20 minutes, they stayed sitting by Mrs. Kennedy. Aubrey assisted her with a cigarette, got her a wet towel to clean herself up with, had a brief chat with her, and was helpful to her in other ways. The signal to Aubrey that the president had expired was when the man with the football, the nuclear football, handcuffed to his wrist in the general's uniform, when he was no longer standing there, he realized that something had gone wrong. And at that point, an agent approached him and asked him to phone his boss and to have him bring a hearse and a casket. And he went to the nursing station at stall 8 where he'd put the epileptic, and the cot was empty. And he asked the nurse, he says, where's our patient? She says, there's never anybody there. So the man vanished. There was no record of admission.
Wow.
Now, Aubrey looks back at that and says, okay, the dispatch was 12:19 on that call. We arrived at the location at 12:20 or 12:21. Kennedy was due in DEALEY PLAZA at 12:20. He was 10 minutes late.
Yep.
So what distraction would this have caused?
Mayhem.
And what distraction did it? Yeah, everything. So anyway, I'll leave that for another time. But like the point you mentioned, one of the really significant things that happened was Aubrey and his partner were asked to go into trauma room 1, sanitize the body, get it wrapped and ready for transfer. When the casket arrived with the hearse, he was notified that Mr. O'Neill was at the ambulance dock. He went out, he and Mr. O'Neill brought the casket, and we have a photo of that happening in the book as well. They bring the casket to Trauma 1, they go to position the body, and as they go to lift him up to put him in the casket, Aubrey happened to put his hand underneath the back of the head, and he felt where the back of the head had been blasted outward. And he could feel what was left of the brain moving on the sheet that was wrapped around the head. And if that's an entry hole, 8 or 9 millimeters or whatever size, you'd never feel that. So prior to this point, I should mention, Mrs. Kennedy entered the room and she pulled the sheet back that was covering the president's torso. She believed she kissed his foot. She also picked up his hand and kissed his hand. And then she tried to put her wedding ring on his finger, and his fingers were a bit larger than hers, and the best she could do was get it on just over the nail of the pinky. So Aubrey reached to the instrument cart, grabbed a tube of KY or K-gel, and he lubricated President Kennedy's pinky for her, and she managed to get it just past the first knuckle. And she kept pushing on it. He says, "You've done fine, ma'am. That's just fine." And of course, he was fighting back tears. And that was just one of those golden moments. He says there was a solitude and just something really unique about being in that room that was unlike anything else. And he says, although this was one of the worst experiences of life, you almost didn't want it to have to end. But then, of course, once they got the president casketed and the last rites were administered and the lid was closed on the casket and everything, then it was time to move out. And then we had a big tug of war with the casket. And of course, the former Dallas County medical examiner, Dr. Earl Rose, just died last week. You may have heard about that.
That's
he
right.
was living in Iowa City. And he was in the corridor citing the fact that in Texas law for Dallas County that they had to do a proper forensic medical examination. And one of the Secret Service agents, according to Dr. McClelland, Dr. McClelland told me, one of the agents, who was about 6'4", picked Dr. Rose up by the armpits, much like you'd pick up a grandfather clock, and carried him back about 10 feet and put him to one side, and he put his finger in his face and just went like this. And that same agent out at the car, when Aubrey got the casket in the car, Mrs. Kennedy tugged on Aubrey's sleeve and she said, "I'd like to ride in the back with my husband." And he says, "Well, ma'am, your husband's nearly 200 pounds. The casket's over 400. If it shifts back there, because I got to angle load it to get you in, you could be hurt." She says, "Well, that's not bad considering what's happened to him." So he went to the side door and set up a jump seat for her, and as he turned to assist her in, he took her by the elbow, and the same agent grabbed him and spun him against the car door and slammed him against the car and said, "Get your GD hands off of her." And I guess Mrs. Kennedy spun around and she said to the agent, she said, "You leave the young man alone. He's the only gentleman I've met today." So, you know, Aubrey said, he says, "My heart was stuck in my sinuses," and he says, "All I could do was to squeak out sort of a high-pitched 'Thank you, ma'am.'" He says, "That's all I could say." But he says, you know, and I said to him, "I guess that's kind of reward enough." He says, in many ways, yeah. He says that was satisfying to know that I was able to do something that somehow helped her through her ordeal, because he said, "I felt so badly for her because from what I could tell, she was completely alone. She didn't seem to have anybody there that was really looking out for her."
Has she ever heard from the family? Did he ever hear from the family since that moment?
I don't think he ever heard from anybody. I really don't. And you know, most of the books you read, including Martin's book, you know, on the Kennedy years, they all mention about her putting her ring on her husband's hand, but nobody mentions Aubrey. And when they do the reenactments, even in Oliver Stone's movie, none of that was featured in the movie. None of that's ever shown. And I think a lot of that is Aubrey's own doing. To him, it was a sacred moment. It was a treasured experience that he didn't want cheapened or commercialized. And I just hounded him for over 20 years. I said, "You've got to get your story out there so that people know what happened. It's not to pat you on the back and tell you what a wonderful guy you are. It's to let people know that she wasn't alone."
Yeah. And it's historical as well.
Yeah.
That's the main thing. We've got to run. We're really late, but listen, I want to thank you for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure to have you here. And thank you for this book on Aubrey. By the way, folks, the book is called At the Door of Memory, The True Story of Aubrey Rike. There's a lot more in the book, folks. I would urge you all to get it. www.nightfrightshow.com. Just click on the book cover associated with tonight's guest. That'll take you right to a spot where you can order the book from the comfort of your own home. I'm Brent Holland from Night Fright. Thanks, Colin.
Hey, that was fun. Thanks. Thanks so much.
See you all next time.
You're listening to Night Fright and your host, Brent Holland. The time is now. Your voice in the dark for paranormal and conspiracy radio.